Okay, so what I have for you guys to see really quickly here is just to get a sense of the wire and how to work with it and how to bend it and a couple of the real basic kinds of things. You know, like I always say, you know, there's always going to be a lot of experimentation, but when you're working with different thicknesses of wire, they can behave differently depending on how thick or thin they are. This is a 16 gauge that I'm using right here, and it presents some challenges for newbies to the wire bending world because it is a little bit thick. The thing that's really nice about this annealed wire right here is the fact that it is soft and it's easy to bend. And so it allows for a pretty substantial, like it holds in place and that sort of thing. Ultimately, you're going to be trying to get as close an approximation of your animal in terms of the gesture and the proportions and the sense of volume. And so I have one right here that's sort of in process going, and then one here that is a little bit further along. I just want to kind of set this in contrast to a white background. So by looking at this against a white background, it's a little easier to see kind of what's going on. I originally started with sort of a shape that went around the outside body to kind of define that outside body. And so I established, you know, essentially the right side and left side of the animal, kind of starting at the head and then kind of coming up and going to the right, and the other side of the wire going to the left of the animal, and establishing the dimension. And then subsequently coming in order to establish the back or the uppermost area of the animal, a dog, and then a little bit in here in terms of establishing the belly. So by looking at it like this, you can kind of get a sense. I mean, as I'm moving it, you can see that that's kind of hard. This is sort of a play pose, if you will. And so, you know, the animal is kind of bending down. You know, a couple of things I noticed as I was going, my space between here and here might actually need to be elongated, especially if I were to bulk this up. But also even just looking at if this is the core right here, as if it were sort of the bone structure, say I was to build up the volume, the space between there and there may not be enough. This one I've done, this limb, the front limb, I've done much more like as if it were the skeletal structure, whereas the back, I haven't done as much like the femur or whatever the specific animal's lower body is, but the kind of bone structure in here, I've a little more defined the sort of outer edge of the volume of the back haunches, if you will. And so you can kind of go either approach, and there's a couple of ways that if this were the armature style that you were going to use for your main project, you would be scaling it up a little bit. It's actually easier when you scale up. Working smaller has a whole different set of challenges. So I probably wouldn't work significantly smaller than this unless your wire happened to be really thin. And if for the Wednesday you could only find, you know, really thin wire, say your 20 or 24 gauge, then I would probably work smaller. Well, you know, the preference and sort of the recommended gauge that I had for you was an 18 gauge, and that's what this is right here. And you can see that it is thinner than this wire that I have. So the lower the number, the thicker the wire, the higher the number, the thinner the wire. I've actually used two different wires in here. I think I used a little bit of the 18 gauge in here, but mostly the 16 gauge. And I use the 18 gauge as a way to bind some of the places with the wire. As an armature, you could theoretically use tape. I'm not real fond of it, but I use wire all the time for my work, and that would not work. And I think that there is something really nice about just learning how to create it stable as a piece in and of itself. And you may find that you really like the wire structure and, you know, even for your armature, and you just kind of like the look of it and you leave that, even if that's not what you do. It sort of becomes like a nice little, a little study of your animal that can kind of stand on its own, even though it was an armature study. A couple of things about wire that I think are really helpful to remember is to work with as long a piece as you possibly can, and to keep thinking of it as if you're kind of coming around one side and going to the other side. And if that becomes difficult, or if you have to, say, for instance, just for logistic purposes, I'm just going to cut this off and kind of take it around and say, I'm going to attach it to the back side of this right here. And say you're like, oh, I really needed to, I cut that because I needed to wrap it around and it was kind of getting awkward, and you need to continue on with, you know, kind of having it go around that side to define the other leg there. So I'm just wrapping it twice and I'm squeezing down on that. So I'm trying to hold it to create a really tight coil, and I can kind of clamp down with my pliers to create that coil. And if you find it's still moving around too much like this, you know, you can either try to crimp it even harder, or, you know, the other thing that you could do is come in with a new piece of wire, kind of thinner piece of wire. And but if I were, in all reality, if I were just to go ahead and instead of wrapping that around there to stabilize it, once I wrap it around, I don't have a lot to work with there, so that's not great in one way, but in another way, it's totally fine. And so if I wrap it around here to kind of stabilize that, then that positions that to be much more stable for that back, kind of the back end, if you will. So, I mean, I only have the one leg done there. This one may, you know, by the time I'm finished, I may decide, oh, that needs to be longer or shorter. And if it's shorter, then I might twist it and just double it back on itself. If it needs to be longer, then I could always sort of start back here somewhere and twist. And then, let me just do it this way. So I might twist like that if I needed to make it longer. And I could then twist this back on here, and I've made it longer because this isn't going to be seen in if it's an armature. You're just looking at the proportions, and I'm going to show you some different ways to build up some of that volume before you were to paper mache. If this ended up being what you were going to do for the main project, you'd be paper macheing. So you got the surface, the skin, if you will, and built out that volume. But you still, in some instances, may have to do some corrections on your armature just to make the proportions correct, either by shortening something or lengthening something or thinning something out. And the thing that's nice about the wire is, theoretically, if I need to twist and move and bend something a little bit, you know, I can still kind of play with that. So my bend on my back legs isn't quite doing what I want it to. So maybe I need to kind of play with that a little bit more to figure that out. But it's really, at this stage, is getting the pose and the gesture and really understanding how do you define the dimension. You can see I've kind of using this to define sort of that side there. Here, sort of the shoulder blade area. It kind of connects from that leg over there and that leg here. And I haven't connected there. I haven't given the volume of the head on here yet. I might do that with a different technique, either using foil as a way to build up that volume, if this ultimately were the technique or approach I was taking. But for Wednesday, for the first day, for the wire armature, you know, getting it in some degree where you have all the limbs, you have a tail, if there's a tail, you have the general proportion of the head, even if it's not fully defined in terms of the width. But just getting, you know, a good bit of that sense of volume figured out is going to put you in good shape for understanding your animal. And so, you know, the wire and then the drawing. And then next week, you know, the subsequent week, we'll be doing some different techniques for figuring out how to put together a basic armature using a different technique. So anyway, hopefully this is helpful for you. You know, the tools you'll need, pliers that have, you know, the cutting device there. That's just a blade that cuts. I personally use these pliers frequently, but if I had to have one pair of pliers, it would be these right here. And I end up having two on hand because I actually work with wire frequently. And, you know, then I can use those for different things, both grabbing, twisting, as well as for cutting.